Tonight's topic is on Me Too and the Bible. But whenever you're doing a topic with the word Bible in it, you always have to clarify, which Bible am I talking about? Because there isn't only one Bible. There's the Hebrew Bible, there's the Old Testament, which is largely the same as the Hebrew Bible in a Protestant setting, but there's also the Catholic Old Testament, which is different from the Protestant Old Testament, has a lot of books in it that the Protestant one doesn't. And then there's the Greek Orthodox Old Testament that has other books in it that the Catholic Bible doesn't have either. So whenever you say in the Bible, you have to clarify which Bible you're talking about. In this case, and in this season actually, Jewish culture owes a debt of gratitude to the Christian, specifically the Catholic and the Greek Orthodox churches. Now, we also have plenty of grievances against the Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox churches. But in this case, we owe them gratitude for a favor they did us. They saved in their Old Testaments some of our literature from the last couple centuries before the Common Era that our rabbis chose to leave out when they were deciding what to keep in the Hebrew Bible. As one example, they didn't preserve the books of Maccabees that the Maccabee kings had commissioned to be written for themselves. First Maccabees and Second Maccabees appear in a Catholic Old Testament and in Greek Orthodox Old Testament. They do not appear in the Hebrew Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. And so for long stretches of time in Jewish history, the real history of the Maccabees was largely unknown because it wasn't studied. The other major source for the Maccabean period, the historian Josephus, was likewise not preserved in Jewish study and knowledge because he wrote in Greek, and it was preserved by the early church. So we do owe the church some gratitude for the knowledge we have of this holiday we're celebrating this week, and that is the celebration of Hanukkah, at least to understand the real history behind it. Of course, when the rabbis, the descendants of the ones that made the canon, decided to define Hanukkah, the ones that decided what were in the Bible, they heard of Hanukkah, they referenced Hanukkah as a calendar date, but they didn't talk about how to celebrate it or what to do or what the reason was behind it. It was only centuries later that the rabbis who made the Talmud, several generations after the ones who chose to leave the book of Maccabees out, they gave a reason for the holiday. And the reason they gave in the Talmud is not the military victory. It is the rededication of the temple, yes, but also the story of the miracle of the light lasting for 8 days. It doesn't appear before that in Jewish or historical literature, not in Josephus and in neither books of First or Second Maccabees. So the miracle of the light story is a story added to a historical event, and it's only due to the Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox Church that we have those primary documents for the early celebration of Hanukkah. Now, I mentioned these books as an introduction to what we're going to be talking about tonight, this question of Me Too and the Bible, because another one of those books the rabbis hid, also sometimes known as the Apocrypha, the hidden books, another one of those apocryphal books is the book of Judith. In Hebrew, it's Yehudit, which is the feminine form of Yehudah, Judah. You can see a very nationalistic name. It's almost like Miss America, right? Is the name Yehudit, Judith. And the book of Judith is connected both to Hanukkah and also, as we'll see, to the Torah portion that we happen to be reading this week, this Torah portion called Vayeshev, which appears in the latter half of the book of Genesis, Genesis 37 to 40. Now, what happens in the book of Judith? Many of you may have not heard of the book of Judith, or if you have, may have not read the book of Judith. The book of Judith is set during the Babylonian invasion of Judea, which is described in the book of Kings and in the book of Jeremiah. And it's set in that time period, but it's very clear that it's really referring to the Maccabean persecution. There are a number of examples of details in the text. I don't want to go into exhaustive detail now, that are clearly references to events that took place during the Maccabean period and not during the Babylonian conquest period. So this is a historical allegory. It's set back in that time. And what happens in the story is Judea is conquered by the Babylonians. Jerusalem is besieged. The siege goes very badly for them, and they're about to give up when a brave and beautiful widow named Yehudit, Judith, shames the men in charge of the city by saying that they're giving up and they don't have enough faith, and she herself promises to solve the problem. And so she cleans herself up, she dresses herself up in her finest clothes and jewelry, and she goes out to meet the armies of the Babylonians that are surrounding Jerusalem. And so what I'll do now is share with you the text from Judith chapter 12 to give you the story. Now, the general that she goes out to meet is a general named Holofernes, which again sounds like a very Greek name compared to a Babylonian name. Again, a hint of a later time period. And so Holofernes says that she should be brought in where his silver vessels were set, and the servants should prepare some delicacies for her, and she should drink from his own wine. And Judith said, I can't eat of it, lest there be an occasion of stumbling, but provision will be made for me from the things that have come with me. She's worried about the dietary laws. Again, this is a much later development in Jewish life in terms of not eating non-Jewish food and wine. And so clearly this is, again, an example of that later time period. But also notice it's setting up her bona fides as a pious woman who will not bend the rules. Holofernes said to her, but if the things that are with you should run out, where will we be able to give you more of it? And Judith says, as your soul lives, my Lord, your servant will not use up those things that are with me until the Lord works by my hand the thing he had determined. It's a wonderfully, ironic statement given what she has planned, as you'll see. She says, don't worry, I'll be done with my business before I run out of food. And we'll find out what her business is. And so she stays in the camp for 3 days, and every night she goes out into the valley to wash herself at the fountain of water in the camp and pray for deliverance. And so she comes back in clean and remains in her tent until the evening. And so on the 4th day, Holofernes made a feast for his servants only and called none of his military officers and said, go now to his eunuch, go now and persuade this Hebrew woman who is with you that she come to us and eat and drink with us. For behold, it would be a disgrace if we shall let such a woman go, not having had her company. For if we don't draw her to ourselves, she will laugh us to scorn. In other words, she's made herself available and she's beautiful, so she must want our attention, right? Well, we understand the problems with those assumptions. And so the eunuch went from the presence of Holofernes and came to her and said, let not this fair lady fear to come to my lord, to drink wine and be merry with us. And Judith says, I don't want to contradict my lord. And so she arose and decked herself with her apparel and her woman's attire, and they laid fleeces on the ground for her next to Holofernes, so she can sit and eat upon him in a seductive pose, Judith came in and sat down, and Holofernes' heart was ravished with her. His passion was aroused, and he exceedingly desired her company. He was watching for a time to deceive her from the day he had seen her. And he said to her, drink now and be merry with us. I will drink now before my lord, because my life is magnified in me, she says. And she took and ate and drank before him what her servant had prepared from her stash. Holofernes took great delight in her and drank exceedingly much wine, more than he had drunk at any time in one day since he was born. But when evening came, the servants hurried to depart. Bagoas the eunuch shut the tent outside and dismissed those who waited from the presence of his lord. They went away to their beds, for they were all weary. The feast had been long, but Judith was left alone in the tent, with Holofernes lying alone upon his bed, for he was drunk with wine. And the servant waited outside as well. All went away, and so Judith says in verse 4, O Lord, God of all power, look in this hour upon the works of my hands for the exaltation of Jerusalem. In verse 6, she came to the bedpost, which was at Holofernes' head, and took down his sword from there. She drew near to the bed, took hold of the hair of his head, and said, strengthen me, O Lord God of Israel, this day. She struck twice upon his neck with all her might and cut off his head, tumbled down his body from the bed, and took down the canopy from the posts. She went out and gave Holofernes' head to her maid, who put it in the bag of food, and they went out together to prayer according to their custom, passed through the camp, circled around the valley, and went up to the gates of Jerusalem. And then by displaying the head of Holofernes in Jerusalem, the Greek armies, the Babylonian armies, lose their heart and flee, and so Judith saves the day. Now, do we call Judith a heroine? Well, she certainly saved the Jews, and sometimes you do have to break some eggs to make an omelet. This is not tiddlywinks they were playing there in a siege where people are starving to death. But Judith becomes emblematic of the underdog that fights back and wins. In fact, there's even some interesting parallels between Judah Maccabee and Judith. In fact, they even have the same name, right? Judah and Yehudit. Now, the story of Judith was not saved by the Hebrews, as I mentioned. It was saved in the Christian Bibles, but a creative retelling of the story did appear in Hebrew around 1,000 years ago. Evidently, some Jews had met some Christians who had this still in their Bible and reworked it into a new version. We don't have an original Hebrew for the book of Judith. And this began to be read specifically during Hanukkah season. One of the interesting shifts and details in the Jewish version of the story is that she uses two things to get him to sleep: a lot of wine and a lot of cheese. I don't know if this is the beginning of the wine and cheese entertainment, probably not. It is reflecting back, however, on an earlier story, the story of Yael and Sisera. Sisera was a Canaanite general who runs away from a battle, and he comes to a tent, and Yael, the woman, gives him wine and dairy products to help him sleep, and he sleeps deeply, and she also kills him. In that case, she drives a tent peg through his head into the ground. So maybe they're trying to make a direct connection to that earlier story in the book of Judges. But whatever the result is, it's one of the reasons why having dairy foods on Hanukkah became an important tradition, like the idea of sour cream on latkes. It wasn't just because they had a lot of sour cream sitting around. It became part of this story of Judith, the brave, who kills the general and encourages Jews to celebrate by eating and drinking what was his downfall. So this is the basic story of Judith and Holofernes. Again, it's bloodier than we might want to think. And I'll show you exactly how bloody it is, because it was actually a popular motif for certain artists in the Renaissance and the late Renaissance. Remember that for Catholic artists, this is part of the Bible as much as the book of Genesis is. So they could do a creation story, or they could do a story of Judith slaying Holofernes. And I warn you, it's a little graphic, but here is a picture of Judith slaying Holofernes. Now, this piece of art is really fascinating, in part because of the artist who painted it. Her name was Artemisia Gentileschi, and she painted a few versions of this painting from 1614 to 1621. And it's become newly popular because it's, again, in the era of Me Too and fighting back and believing women and so on. Think of that Fearless Girl statue that was on Wall Street some years ago. This is the same kind of motif that people are drawing on looking back, and seeing a woman painter do it is even more powerful. You can see, I mean, what's really striking, actually, let me, instead of telling you, take a look at this painting. Now that you've read the story or seen parts of the story, what's really striking to you about this depiction of this climactic moment in the story? What jumps out at you looking at the picture?
There are two women involved.
Okay, in this case, it shows the maid there holding him down along with Judith, where in the story the maid was supposed to be outside. So there's a little bit of license taken with the retelling of it. I
knew the story. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I knew the story. Of course, you know, my name's Judith, so I wanted to know the story. But I imagined it differently. It's interesting to see this picture because I thought he was fast asleep. And then I imagined more like a hatchet, almost kind of thing coming down. He's fighting. I mean, he's like trying to, you know, dispel her. I mean, so that part I didn't, and that somebody was holding him down. So that's new. Of course, we don't know exactly what happened, but.
Well, and this is an artist's interpretation thousands of years later, you know, they're allowed to play with the story of it, but it is interesting to note that detail that he's fighting back and still losing.
You're right.
Yeah. Any other details people notice?
He appears to be at least partially undressed.
Yeah. Yeah.
I always thought she was hacking the knife from the front, not from the side. This is almost like she's slicing it off. Mm-hmm. And per her drawings, lots of blood.
Yeah, remember, this is one of many versions of this that she painted. She did a few versions of it in different churches in different settings.
Traditional Christian symbology of the sword having a cross-like figure.
Yep. Yeah, you can see that. I mean, again, notice the blood. I mean, this is an active painting, right? This is, I mean, they're not moving, but you can feel action and motion and straining and energy and anger. And, you know, you see a lot of emotion in that still photo. And this particular style is not unique to this artist. It reflects a particular style of the late Renaissance where the background is very dark. And so the foreground is very lit. So you see the action happening here. Now, what makes this painting particularly poignant is that it may reflect a desire for revenge by the artist Artemisia herself. Because when she was a budding artist beginning to take lessons, and she was only 17 years old, her mentor, Agostino Tassi, snuck into her house and raped her. And she, for a time, maintained a relationship with him because the thought was that he would marry her as a way to restore her honor. As we'll see, that's one of the biblical solutions to rape, is to marry the couple. But in the end, after several months, he refused to marry her. And so then her father actually sued him for having raped her. And this is, again, in the 1610s. And in fact, the suit was successful. But you can imagine there's a lot of built up anger there with her against him. And one of the interesting details, her first version of this was painted in 1614. This version was painted in 1621. And one of the details that an art critic noticed that I read, I didn't see it myself, is on her arm, if you looked closely, you would see a logo of the goddess Artemis. And remember, the artist's name is Artemisia. And so the Judith there has a bracelet that has a logo of the goddess Artemis on it that would, you know, it's not quite signing your name, but it's pretty close. And of course, it's also totally inaccurate compared to the biblical story because Judith is supposed to be this wonderfully pious Hebrew woman who would never wear an amulet of a goddess on her arm. You know, if she wouldn't even eat the food, she certainly wouldn't wear an amulet of a goddess from Greek mythology when this is set in the Babylonian period. Okay, so you understand the collapsing of time and space that takes place when we're trying to depict these pictures. But if you like the way that she portrays the women in this, notice how strong they are, how active they are, and in this case, how zealous for justice they are. They are really getting heroic treatment here. And she does that with a number of other female characters. Esther is another one that she's portrayed a few times, and really gives you interesting insight into what it was like as a woman living in the Renaissance and having the history that she did and empathizing with these women living in that world. So what's your assessment of the Judith character? Is she a seductress who used her wiles to get what she wanted? Is it illegitimate what she did, or anything's necessary in circumstances like this? And how different is today than back then?
You know, it depends on what line what side of the line you're standing as to whether you're a freedom fighter or a terrorist. It's all a matter of perspective. So from the Jewish aspect, she's definitely a hero, and the Babylonians were going to decimate the Jews in Jerusalem. And from that aspect, she's a hero. But from the Babylonian side, she's just one more terrorist. So it all depends on your perspective. I think of her as a hero. In the museum, in the Detroit Museum of Art, is another version of this painting by her. And when you read about her life and how hard it was to be a woman artist, a woman painter in the Renaissance, and her father, who was an artist, did her no favors. So, I mean, I really admire her for her life. And so I'm siding with Judith.
I think both Leora's notation in terms of a woman artist in the Renaissance and the story are sort of national personifications. Lady Liberty, Columbia, this is Judith versus the Greeks. So this is a playing out of national animosity and probably playing out of individual animosity for the artist.
Rabbi, I've got a question. If this is allegorical to the Maccabees and to the Greek occupation, obviously this is a story of a Babylonian siege of Jerusalem that was defeated. Historically, are they talking about allegorically, but using a real event? Was there a defeat of a Babylonian siege of Jerusalem?
Well, there were two waves of Babylonian sieges. There was one in around 597 and one in 586. And in the 597 one, they imposed the governor, but they didn't sack the city. That's this governor named Gedaliah who later gets assassinated. So the Judah story, I believe, is set during that earlier siege in 597, where they managed to get away without Jerusalem being destroyed. It's in 586 that it ultimately does collapse and gets destroyed. So it's in that window period. Yeah. So, but you can see also why Judith has an interesting resonance in the Maccabean rebellion, because it's fighting back. It's praying, it's having belief, but it's also taking it into your own hands and doing it. So what we're going to do now is take a look at that Torah portion.
I'm sorry, I had a quick question.
Yes,
it
please.
makes me wonder who wrote the story. It's obviously a story, and with having women being so strong, was written by males, of course. So I'm just wondering on the background of who the author or authors were for this story, making females heroes.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, and that happens in other stories. You've got Esther, for example, and
Right.
The story of Deborah, who is a judge and who leads people in battle. So there are episodes like that. And, you know, it's one of these cases where the extraordinary case doesn't always help everybody. You know, on one hand, it's wonderful to have a role model like this, but if you get one every 300 years, there's such an exceptional example that nobody can live up to it. And that doesn't help the mass of people who are assumed to be like everybody else. And this is the odd woman who's able to do it and who's able to be active and intervene. So, you know, when you talk about a social revolution, it's not just, for example, it's not just the elite woman who can afford to go to the private clinic who can get an abortion. You know, it should be something that's available as a healthcare choice for anybody. And other examples of issues like that, where it becomes a broad-based issue, not just the elite, the exception that gets to do it. I'll also mention as one other example in the news recently, you may have heard that there's some noise being made about an attempt by Chinese espionage to send over women to seduce certain representatives and intelligence agents and draw information from them. We also had this case of Maria Butina, or whatever her name was, who infiltrated the NRA. The idea of the seductive spy who lures you in is not old and is not new and is still part of the lexicon, because honestly, it works. If men didn't let it work, it wouldn't work, and until that wouldn't be done. You know, so if you're in the espionage game, Judith might be a role model for you. So now looking at Genesis chapter 37 and following, this Torah portion, Vayeshev, is part of the Joseph Saga, because in chapter 37, the beginning of this portion we're not going to look at, Joseph is set upon by his brothers who are jealous of him because of his father's favoritism towards him and these dreams he's had, predicting that they will all bow down to him. And so his brothers take him and throw him into a pit. And then instead of killing him, they decide to sell him into slavery instead. And they take a goat and put the goat's blood on the coat of many colors. And Jacob is convinced that his son, his favorite son, has been killed. And so then Joseph is sent into slavery. He's sold off to Potiphar, who's one of Pharaoh's agents, high up in his officer corps. And ultimately, Joseph begins his rise to power as he goes down into prison and then begins interpreting the dreams of other people. And he starts with the cupbearer and the baker, and that ultimately will lead him to interpreting Pharaoh's dreams and being successful. But in the middle of this Torah portion, in chapters 38 and 39, we have two episodes that raise important and even disturbing issues of power and freedom and sex that still resonate in the current Me Too era. So we're going to take a look at those and see how they reflect the issues we're grappling with today. So in chapter 38, it describes Judah, one of the 12 brothers, who was willing to sell him off into slavery. He left his brothers and camped near an Adulamite. There he saw the daughter of a Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he married her and cohabited with her. Well, right away, this should raise a flag for you because he's marrying a Canaanite, not someone from inside the clan. And often when you marry outside, sometimes there are problems that come up. So it's already highlighting that at the beginning. Shua conceived and bore a son whom he named Er. She conceived again and bore a son and named him Onan. And once again, she bore a son and named him Shelah. Judah got a wife for Er, his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Er, Judah's firstborn, was displeasing to Yahweh, to the Hebrew God, the Lord, and the Lord took his life. We don't know exactly what Er did, doesn't really matter. Then Judah said to Onan, join with your brother's wife and do your duty by her as a brother-in-law and provide offspring for your brother. This is part of an ancient tradition described in other laws in the Torah that if a brother dies with no heirs, no children to take his name and his property, then one of his brothers goes into the widow, literally, and produces a child that will then be attributed to the brother who died. So it's a substitute. It's called levirate marriage, is the technical term. So Judah says to Onan, this is what you should do. But Onan, knowing that the seed would not count as his, let it go to waste whenever he joined with his brother's wife. So this is, the technical term is coitus interruptus, as a birth control method, so as not to provide offspring for his brother. And what he did was displeasing to Yahweh, and he took his life also. By the way, this is one of the bases for, in many fundamentalist, Orthodox Jewish, as well as Christian traditions, the prohibition on male masturbation because of the spilling of seed. It's actually called the sin of Onan, or onanism. If you look it up in a dictionary, you'll find that term dating back to this story. Now Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, stay as a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grow up. So he thought he too might die like his brothers. Maybe this woman Tamar is the bad luck because she's already killed 2 of his sons. And he doesn't want to risk the 3rd one. So Tamar went up to live in her father's house, and a long time afterward, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died. And when his period of mourning was over, he went up to Timnah to shear his sheep. And Tamar was told, your father-in-law is coming up. She's been in limbo as a widow for all this time, waiting to get married to the 3rd son. Because she belongs to the clan now, you see. She's not a free agent to go marry whomever she wants. She's part of her father's household, or she's part of her father-in-law's household into whom she married, into that clan. And so she belongs to the clan. She can't do anything until he marries her to the 3rd son. She takes off her widow's garb in verse 14. She covered her face with a veil and wrapping herself up, sat down at the entrance to Enaim because she saw that Shelah had grown up and she had not been given to him as a wife. When Judah saw her, he took her for a zonah, for a whore, for a harlot, because she had covered her face. We notice the detail there. What makes her attractive is concealment. We would think you show more, right? But perhaps the fact that she covered her face, in this case, married women showed their faces, and those who were available would have an open face. And she's also sitting on the road. She's a streetwalker, literally. She's on the road there. So he turned aside to her by the road and said, here, let me sleep with you. He did not know it was his daughter-in-law. What, she said, will you pay for sleeping with me? He replied, I will send a kid from my flock. I'll send you a check tomorrow. But she said, you must leave a pledge until you have sent it. He said, what pledge shall I give you? She said, your seal and cord and the staff you carry, the tokens of your authority and identity. And his desire was great, so he gave them to her and slept with her, and she conceived by him. And she went on her way. She took off her veil and again put on her widow's garb. Judah sent the kid by his friend the Adulamite. He didn't want to go himself. That's a little too risky. To redeem the pledge from the woman. But the Adulamite could not find her. Where's the harlot that was by the side of the road? She's gone. Where is the cult prostitute, the one by the road? They said, there's been no prostitute here. So he returned to Judah and said, I couldn't find her. And the townspeople said there was none. Judah said, forget it. Let her keep them, lest we become a laughingstock. The more I ask, the more it's going to come out that I did this thing. 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot. She's been the zonah. She is with child by this. Bring her out and let her be burned, he said. As she's brought out, she sent this message to her father-in-law. I am with child by the man to whom these belong. Whose seal and cord and staff are these? Judah recognized them and said, she is more in the right than I am, inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelach, and he was not intimate with her again. And when she gave birth, she had twins. She gives birth to twins, and so on. So what do you make of this story of Judah and Tamar? It's a skewed world that they're working in, but Tamar is trying to do her best under the circumstances. Again, do you think what she's doing is too underhanded or too risky, or the right thing?
What would have been the implications of her not bearing a child? I mean, did her father not want to support her? Or, first of all, it pisses all of us women off when we hear these stories, of course, and just what's happened, throughout the centuries for women and even up until kind of recently. But what would have been to me, if she did it to survive, then it's the right thing to do. You do what you have to do to survive. But I'm not clear if she lived with her father, if it was needed, and what are the implications for not conceiving a child? I mean, I don't know.
If she's a widow in this limbo position, there's provisions in the law for the poor and the orphan and the widow. The widow is one of those categories that gets to glean the fields or harvest the corners of the fields, because they're the ones that are most destitute. They have no land. Only men can own land. There's one weird circumstance where women can own land until they get married. If their father dies and has no sons, then the daughters can inherit the land temporarily. And once they get married, it passes to their fathers. And remember, it's not that long ago that women couldn't apply for a credit card without their husband signing for them, or get a mortgage, or any of those, financial ownership issues in America. This is not in the old world here. So economic independence is relatively new for women. And this is just reflecting a society in which the women are a vehicle for the patrimony. It doesn't ask what her opinion is. What does she think about marrying her brother-in-law or her brother-in-law again? It doesn't matter. She is the womb. She is the route to create heirs for the land, and her opinion is on some level irrelevant.
Yeah, but by the same token, I'm sorry. I was going to say, by the same token, though, the idea was that single women didn't have a position within society, and so as a widow, she really has no position in society. So that's the levirate marriage is designed to provide for support for the women whose husbands have died. Of course, it also provides for the patrilineal continuation of a line, which is what it's supposed to do. So in a way, she did what she needed to do in order to fulfill what the society expected of her, which Judah was denying her in the way that he'd set it up with the third son. I'm not vouching for the validity of the way it's set up, but that's the structure, and she has to live within that structure. She has no choice, or else she becomes an outcast, and what's she going to do then?
Yeah. Let me, Cindy, and then Roger.
I remember being told that she would have been considered like cursed, or that something was wrong with her, because if she hadn't conceived with her husband, and then that's bad enough, but then if the family also is not following through with that tradition, then then people kind of speculate, well, why wouldn't they? What is it about her? And so then is she cursed by God? Is she cursed by, is she a terrible person? And so even though there were things in place to take care of her, she would have had a much greater social consequence, being rejected by, so thoroughly.
Right. And ironically, she would bear the burden, even though it was her father-in-law who was the one doing the wrong thing by not allowing her to try a third time. Yeah, Roger, go ahead.
So obviously, other than the supposition of that book of Jay that came out a bunch of years ago, this was all written by men. I'm seeing Judith seducing the general. I'm seeing Tamar seducing her father-in-law. Poor Esther's, King Ahasuerus. Are there any examples of men doing this, or is it just women using their wiles to get men?
Well, actually, we'll see something similar to that in the next chapter, a sort of role reversal of what happens in the Judah and Tamar story with Joseph and Potiphar's wife. So we'll have to come back to that.
Okay.
Yeah, Leo, please.
Just going back to what Cindy said and what Lauren said, she was required to marry, or the brother-in-law was required to marry her, or she went back to her father's house to be taken care of. But you don't know what taken care of means. He has to provide her with a home or with a house. But that doesn't mean that she's an active participant in the household. That doesn't mean that she's not used as a slave. That doesn't mean that she's cared for. It just means there's a roof over her head. And if you need to survive, you need to survive, and you do what you have to do to survive. And
also notice the treatment of how a woman dresses in public as a sign of what she is or is not willing to do, right? It's the same Tamar that was there before, but by how she dresses and where she sits herself and which street she's on, and the interpretation of who she is and what she's available or interested in doing is radically different. And we're not that far from that either. What you wear and your behavioral choices can undermine, cases of rape accusation and so on. And, this is not that long ago that was used, and it's still a problem in many cases. The proportion of rapes that happen that are not charged or are not prosecuted is appalling. If you want to get mad, look up some of those statistics, and you'll be shocked. I mean, even getting old kits tested where they've actually acquired the DNA material of the perpetrator, and no one's bothered to even test it against the databases, the blood types, and everything else that they have is shocking. But this is a case that's just not been taken as seriously, and in part because of she must have been asking for it. She must have been in the wrong place, as opposed to blaming the person who did it. Notice how much more Judah can get away with. He shows up, he propositions a prostitute in front of everybody. He then, his wife is still alive, I think, or did she die? No, she had died. His wife had died. They want to clarify that his wife had died. But he didn't have to marry her to have relations with her. And then he gives up his seal and his cord and his stamp, like all these signs of his personality and authority, to a prostitute, and never gets them back, and nothing happens. This is the classic double standard. He gets away with it. But notice also the parallels between what Tamar has to do and what we saw Judith having to do in the book of Judith, because they both have to play on their assets, so to speak, and work within this system that is limiting and problematic for them. And in the end, they both succeed in their objective, but it has to happen in the rules of the game and with the limitations of the time. Any last thoughts on Tamar before we go on to the next chapter? Yeah, Peggy, please.
If you look at what's happening today, look at the politicians, the CEOs, the presidents. It hasn't changed much, losing their positions.
Yeah. Or not. That's unfortunately also true.
One quick thing, we're all assuming here that the men wrote these stories. It might really have been the men signed their name to it and their wives wrote some of the stories, because that happened with some classical symphonies. And because women were not particularly educated at that time, and the ones that had education probably kept it hidden, it might not be clear what the true origin of the story is, and that's just a thought.
Sure, and also to support that, there's probably an oral stage of transmission of the story where it's just a story told around a campfire, told in hearths at homes, and there's no literacy required to be able to tell a story. That's not a question. That's not a function of education. That's listening and memory and being able to speak. It's verbal ability. So it may well be that even if men were the only ones who were taught to write, women could certainly tell stories and create stories and hand down stories. And that's the premise behind a creative midrash book called The Red Tent, which is a reimagining Jacob's wives. And it's saying that these are the stories the women passed down and the men didn't listen because they don't know anything. So let's go back to Genesis, because we're going to look at the next chapter to see that reversal of roles. So here in chapter 39, when Joseph was taken down to Egypt, a certain Egyptian, Potiphar, a courtier of Pharaoh, his chief steward, brought him from the Ishmaelites who had bought him. And the Lord was with Joseph. He was successful, staying in the house of his Egyptian master. And when his master saw that Yahweh was with him and the Lord lent success to everything that Joseph undertook, he took a liking to Joseph. He made him his personal attendant and put him in charge of his household, placing in his hand all that he owned. And from that time on, the Lord blessed the house for Joseph's sake. Everything was successful. And Joseph, now it points out at the end of verse 6, now Joseph was well built and handsome. Just like Judith, right? Attractive. After a time, his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph and said, lie with me. And the Hebrew is literally, shichva imi, lie down with me. But he refused. He said to his master's wife, look, with me here, my master gives no thought to anything in this house. All that he owns, he has placed in my hands. He wields no more authority in this house than I do. He has withheld nothing from me except you, since you are his wife. It's almost like he's reminding her, by the way, just reminding you, you're his wife. Don't forget your role too here. How then could I do this most wicked thing and sin before God? As much as she coaxed Joseph day after day, he did not yield to her request to lie beside her, to be with her. So this is repeated now. He says no. She won't take no for an answer. She continues to urge him, to invite him. One such day he came into his house to do his work, none of the household being there inside. She called hold of him by his garment, his clothing. Again, notice the importance of clothing here. And said, lie down with me. But he left his garment in her hand and got away and fled outside. So this is trying to evade, but again, leaving behind a piece of clothing. Notice the parallel to Jacob, to Judah in the previous chapter, leaving behind a piece of clothing. When she saw that he had left it in her hand and had fled outside, she called out to her servants and said to them, look, he had to bring us a Hebrew to dally with us. This one came to lie with me, but I screamed loud. Now, the translation for dally is interesting. It says in the Hebrew, Hevi lanu ish ivri, he brought us a Hebrew man, litzachek banu, literally to laugh at us, to make fun of us, to mock us. This one came to lie with me, and I screamed out loud. Now, of course, we know she didn't scream out loud. And when he heard me screaming at the top of my voice, he left his garment with me and got away and fled outside. And she kept the garment beside her until the master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, the Hebrew slave whom you brought into our house came to dally with me. Again, litzachek bi, to make fun with me, or to make sport with me, or to humble me, to mock me. But when I screamed at the top of my voice, he left his garment with me and fled outside. When the master heard the story his wife told him, thus and so your slave did to me, he was furious. But notice how it's phrased as the Hebrew slave, what the slave had done to her. So the hierarchy and the power dynamic here is part of the story. He was furious. So Joseph's master put him in prison where the king's prisoners were confined. And this is when he begins to get the opportunity to interpret dreams and to start his rise back up. So what do you make of the Joseph and Potiphar's wife story? Again, there's some interesting parallels to Judah, also interesting parallels to Judith. And so what jumps out at you about that Joseph and Potiphar's wife episode?
It's women like this who give women a bad name.
women be lying, some people say.
Well, and supposedly why society doesn't believe women when they say they've been raped.
Mhm.
It might also have to do with the whole history of slavery, because look at what happened in the US and the South. The former slaves, even during that time, there was all of this, and even years after, were African Americans, and I'm not being very coherent tonight, but the point is that there was all of these accusations of rape by white women that led to lynchings of Black men and hanging from trees. So it's a power dynamic as well as bias.
Right. And even the accusation of whistling at a woman, that was the famous Emmett Till story. Not that he had even touched a woman, but that he had whistled at her, or he had disrespected her, mocked her, brought her lower than her status. And that was seen as a violation of the cultural norms, ultimately to his torture and death. So similarly here, Joseph as the Hebrew slave is in an awkward position here, in many ways, because Potiphar's wife is encouraging him to come to her. He has to say no multiple times. He knows if he reports it, he's going to get in trouble. In the end, she grabs his clothing and he flees rather than sleep with her, or even lie down with her, even, to lie down and then get away. And he still is blamed for it and thrown into prison because of what's claimed to be the attempt. Yeah, Leora, go ahead.
I find it interesting that the word they use is not litzchok, to laugh, but litzachek, which is to play with. So the servant who has, come to play with us, which is slightly different. I mean, they could easily have used the other word. So why didn't they?
Well, I mean, a lot of the biblical approach to sex is euphemism. When you say lavo aleha, like he came upon her or he came unto her, you'll often hear in old translations, they had sex. That's what it means. But they don't want to say that. So they use this euphemism of he arrived at her or something like that. And so the same is true for this. She says, lie down with me, but you know what she means. And he came to make sport with me, or to fool around with me, or to toy with me, or to play with me, okay, so there's that substitute there. And I think that in this case, the idea of the mocking is important, because this also shows up in the story of the rivalry between Ishmael and Isaac. Because one of the things that pisses Sarah off is that the son of her slave, Ishmael, is making sport or playing, again, letzachek, with Isaac, ironically, whose name is from the same root as to laugh. But it's the servant is getting uppity. Remember that term, uppity? And this is the risk for Joseph. He's getting uppity, she says, to Potiphar, when in reality, he's actually been even more loyal to Potiphar than could have been expected. More loyal than Potiphar's wife has been to Potiphar. Joseph is a better partner than the wife is. So here we have a story that draws us into these questions of loyalty and fidelity, but also power dynamics and the question of lying and the very difficult issue of rape. And so the last text I wanted to show you briefly before we wrap up is a passage from Deuteronomy, which describes what you're supposed to do in the case of a rape. This is in Deuteronomy chapter 22. These are, by the way, all terrible passages about what happens if you think she had an affair and what happens if you think she wasn't a virgin and so on. But here in verse 22, if a man is found lying with a woman married to a husband, then they shall both die, the man who lay with the woman and the woman. Verse 23, if there is a young lady who is a virgin, pledged to be married to a husband, and a man finds her in the city and lies with her, then you shall bring them both out to the gate of that city, and you shall stone them to death with stones. The lady, because she didn't cry being in the city, assuming people would have heard her, and the man, because he has humbled his neighbor's wife. so you shall remove the evil from among you. But if the man finds the lady who is pledged to be married in the field, and the man forces her and lies with her, then only the man who lies with her shall die, but to the lady you shall do nothing. There is in the lady no sin worthy of death. For if he found her in the field, the pledged to be married lady cried, and there was no one to save her. And now, verse 28, which brings us back to Artemisia. If a man finds a lady who is a virgin, who is not pledged to be married, grabs her and lies with her, and they are found, then the man who lay with her shall give to the lady's father 50 shekels of silver. She shall be his wife, for he has humbled her. He may not put her away all of his days. Never allowed to divorce. Now that was what the plan was for Artemisia. She had been raped, and the plan was that they would be married. And when he broke that provision, then the lawsuit, and then the revenge fantasy artwork. But what we see in this story is that questions of rape and being believed and crying out or not crying out are still issues we grapple with today. Why didn't she speak up before? Why didn't she speak up at the time? Who did she talk to and what did she say? And evaluating and questioning and doubting. And many people think of this as the world of the past. But just this week, there was a major investigation at Fort Hood into a pervasive culture of sexual harassment and sexual assault that resulted in 14 officers and leaders on that base being disciplined or even fired. And so the Me Too issues that are highlighted by the story of Judith, by the story of Judah and Tamar, and by the story of Joseph in Potiphar's house are still questions that we grapple with today. I think we've made some progress, but there's still more to be done. And hopefully if Hanukkah provides a model, it gives us the example of lighting lights to dispel darkness. And the more light we provide, the more we can understand the world and each other.